My daughter. In-law kicked me out. I returned with someone she never expected. Her face turned pale. My daughter-in-law, Claudia, smirked at me from across the living room, thinking she'd won. She believed she had successfully kicked an old woman to the curb and claimed a $2.1 million lakeside mansion as her prize. I could almost see her mentally measuring the walls for new, garish paintings. But my eyes weren't on her. They were on my son, Victor, and on the old, intricately carved wooden box I placed on the mahogany table between us. A box that held a truth more valuable and far more devastating than any house. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The drive back to my own home, a place I was no longer welcome, was silent. My oldest friend, Evelyn Hart, sat beside me, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers did little to cut through the oppressive tension. The New England sky wept, its gray tears streaking down the glass, mirroring the storm inside my heart. When we stepped through the grand oak doors, the air in the foyer was thick and cold. Claudia stood with her arms crossed, a picture of smug victory. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive silk blouse seemed out of place against the backdrop of my family's history. She was expecting a fight, I knew. She was probably anticipating lawyers, legal threats, a desperate plea for mercy. She was prepared for a battle over property. She was not prepared for Evelyn, and she certainly wasn't prepared for the truth. I walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture, my gaze locked on my son. Victor sat slumped in his father's favorite armchair, refusing to meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the oriental rug, his shoulders hunched. A flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or was it fear, crossed his face before he smoothed it into a mask of indifference. "I assume you're here to collect the rest of your things," Claudia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't take too long. The decorators are coming tomorrow." I ignored her. Evelyn moved with a quiet grace, placing the old wooden box on the coffee table. The sound it made, a soft thud against the polished wood, echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. It was a sound of finality. Claudia's smirk faltered. "What's this? Some old junk you forgot?" Finally, I spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, cutting through the air with the sharp edge of tempered steel. I didn't look at Claudia. I looked only at my son, forcing him to finally lift his head. "Claudia," I said, my tone low and clear, "you have taken everything from me, my home, my memories, my peace. But there is one thing that you and Victor will never be able to take, and that is the truth." The confidence in the room evaporated. Claudia's perfectly made-up face went slack, confusion replacing her arrogance. Victor's eyes widened, a dawning horror creeping into them as he stared at the box. He knew what it was, or at least, he knew what it represented. A promise. A secret. The box sat there between us, a silent witness, its dark wood holding a story that was heavier, darker, and worth far more than the deed to this house. It held a debt that was about to be paid in full. 3 months earlier, the world still made sense. The cracks in my family's foundation were there. I see that now, but they were hidden beneath the varnish of routine and unspoken history. I was in my late husband Arthur's study, a room that was more a sanctuary than an office. The late afternoon sun, the color of weak tea, filtered through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of old paper and worn leather hung heavy, a comforting perfume of a life well lived and well read. I was sorting through his collection of Renaissance art history texts, my fingers tracing the gold leaf titles on the spines. Each book was a memory. I could almost hear Arthur's voice, excitedly explaining the nuances of a Titian brushstroke. A quiet smile touched my lips. It was in these moments that he felt closest. The door creaked open, pulling me from my reverie. It was Victor. He didn't come in to help, or even to reminisce. He came in carrying a cloud of discontent around him like cheap cologne. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved in his pockets, a familiar frown creasing his brow. "That tech stock I told you about," he began, without so much as a hello. "It tanked. Lost a couple thousand." I turned, placing a heavy volume back on the shelf. "Oh, Victor, I'm sorry to hear that, but investments are always a risk." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "A risk, right. Easy for you to say. You and Dad never had to take real risks. Your money was always just there. Old, safe, tied up in this house, and all these dusty books." The accusation in his tone, the way he dismissed his father's life's work as dusty books, was a small, sharp sting. "That's not fair, Victor. Your father worked very hard." "Working hard isn't the same as getting your hands dirty," he shot back, finally stepping into the room. He gestured vaguely at the shelves, his eyes sweeping over them with disdain. "This was your world, yours and his. Art, history, all that high-minded stuff. Did either of you ever once stop to ask what I wanted? What I was interested in?" I was taken aback, completely blindsided. "Of course we did. We supported you in everything." "You paid for things," he said, his voice rising. "You paid for business school. You paid for the down payment on my first house. But you never took me seriously. To you, I was just the son who wasn't an academic, the one who cared about balance sheets instead of Botticelli." The resentment, raw and ugly, poured out of him. It was a poison he had been nursing for years, and I had been utterly oblivious. I saw him not as my 46-year-old son, but as a petulant boy with a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. "That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We were proud of you." "Proud?" he scoffed, the sound echoing off the silent watching books. "You were relieved I wasn't a complete failure. There's a difference. You and Dad, you were always up in the clouds with your symphonies and your European travels. I was down here, on the ground, trying to make something of myself in the real world. I was just a shadow in this house. Your shadow, his shadow, never my own man." His words hit me harder than a physical blow. A shadow. He felt like a shadow in his own home. All the love, the support, the sacrifices Arthur and I had made, he saw none of it. He saw only what he lacked, what he perceived as our judgment. The silence that fell between us was heavy, suffocating. He had just rewritten our entire family history into a narrative of neglect and disappointment. He stood there for another moment, breathing heavily, as if the confession had drained him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the quiet, sun-drenched study. I sank into Arthur's worn leather chair, the room suddenly feeling cold. The books that had been my comfort moments before now felt like silent accusers. A deep, jagged crack had just split open at my feet, and I had the terrifying feeling that my entire world was about to fall into it. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. Victor's words from the study echoed in my mind, a cruel and relentless loop of resentment. A shadow in this house. I tossed and turned, the fine linen sheets feeling coarse and abrasive against my skin. The silence of the grand old home, usually a comfort, now felt heavy and accusatory. Around 2 a.m, I gave up, my throat dry with a thirst that felt deeper than physical. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I slipped out of bed, pulling on my silk robe. The polished hardwood floors were cool beneath my bare feet as I made my way downstairs, navigating the familiar landscape of my home in the dark. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows in the hall, painting silver stripes across the floor and illuminating the portraits of Roland ancestors. Their stern, oil-painted eyes seemed to follow me with silent judgment. As I neared the kitchen, I saw a sliver of light escaping from under the door, and then I heard voices, low and conspiratorial. It was Victor and Claudia. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something told me not to go in, not to announce myself. I shrank back into the shadows of the hallway, my heart beginning to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "It's just like I told you," Victor was saying, his voice thick with a self-pity that was becoming all too familiar. A shadow. That's all I've ever been to her. To both of them. Then came Claudia's voice, smooth and sharp as a shard of glass. "Oh, honey, of course you are. You see, I've been telling you this for years." There was no sympathy in her tone, only a chilling note of triumph. She was not comforting him. She was stoking a fire. "She doesn't respect what I do," Victor mumbled. "She thinks my work is just grubbing for money." "And what's wrong with that?" Claudia purred. "Someone has to live in the real world. Someone has to build something. She and your father had their heads in the clouds, Victor. They looked down on you because you wanted something tangible, something real." I pressed my ear closer to the door, my breath caught in my throat. This was more than just a wife comforting her husband. This was a calculated dissection of my son's deepest insecurities. Claudia was playing him like a fiddle. "She'll never see you as an equal," Claudia continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, venomous and intimate. "She'll never truly acknowledge you. Not really. In her eyes, you'll always be the boy who couldn't appreciate art, who wasn't intellectual enough." She paused, letting the poison sink in. I could picture her placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "This house, Victor," she said, her voice now laced with a false, righteous anger. "This house is the only thing you truly deserve. It's not an inheritance. It's repayment. It's the compensation you're owed for a lifetime of being made to feel second best. For every time they dismissed your ambitions. For every moment you felt like a ghost in your own home." My blood ran cold. She was taking the very words he had thrown at me and twisting them into a weapon against me. "Take it," she urged, her voice hardening. "Take it. And you prove her wrong. You prove them all wrong. Sell it, invest the money, and build an empire so big she can't ignore it. Show her you're not a failure. Show her you're more of a man than your father ever was." A terrible, ringing silence followed. I waited, my entire being screaming for Victor to push back, to defend his father, to defend me. I prayed for him to say, "That's enough, Claudia." To tell her she had gone too far. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. It was an answer more damning than any words could ever be. It was the sound of his consent, the sound of his betrayal. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp. It felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. In that moment, I finally saw my daughter-in-law for what she was, a venomous snake. And she had found the wound in my son's heart, a wound I never even knew existed, and sunk her fangs deep into it, pumping him full of her poison. I backed away from the door, stumbling into the darkness of the hall. The sliver of light from the kitchen seemed a world away. I was utterly alone, an intruder in my own home, listening to the quiet, methodical destruction of my family. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Claudia had stopped pretending. The false sweetness was gone, replaced by a cold, dismissive tolerance, as if I were a piece of furniture she hadn't yet gotten around to replacing. The air in the house was thick with unspoken hostility, a tension so heavy you could cut it with a knife. Victor was a ghost, flitting in and out, avoiding my gaze, his guilt a palpable aura around him. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, waiting for the final sentence to be handed down. It came on a Tuesday night. A storm was raging outside, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the old eaves. The weather was a perfect match for the tempest brewing inside the living room. Claudia was pacing in front of the fireplace, a glossy interior design magazine rolled up in her hand like a baton. "This whole wall could be opened up," she said, gesturing with the magazine. "We could have a clean, modern media center, but that thing is in the way." She was pointing at Arthur's grand piano. It was a magnificent Steinway, its polished ebony surface gleaming in the firelight. It was the heart of the room, the keeper of 1,000 memories of evening concerts, Christmas carols, and my husband's hands dancing over the keys. "We are not getting rid of the piano, Claudia," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I was sitting in my usual armchair, a book lying open but unread in my lap. She turned to me, an incredulous, mocking smile on her face. "Agnes, be serious. It's a relic. It's dark, it's heavy, and it takes up a third of the room. It has to go." "It was your father-in-law's," I said, my eyes flicking to Victor, who was standing by the window, pretending to watch the storm. "It stays." "It's worth a lot of money," Claudia pressed on, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Money we could use for the renovations, money that could be put into Victor's new business venture." "Some things are more important than money," I replied, my patience wearing dangerously thin. Claudia let out a sharp, theatrical laugh. "Oh, please, don't give me the old money lecture. Your sentimentality is holding us back. It's holding Victor back." That was it. The final straw. I stood up, my body trembling with a cold fury. "This is my husband's legacy you are talking about. This is my home." Claudia's smile vanished. Her face hardened into a cruel, triumphant mask. She took a step toward me, her eyes glittering. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "You're wrong. This isn't your house anymore. You should leave." The words hung in the air, brutal and absolute. The clock on the mantelpiece seemed to stop ticking. The roaring fire seemed to fall silent. I felt the blood drain from my face. My gaze shot to my son, my protector, my child. He was still standing by the window, his back to us. "Victor?" I whispered his name. It was a question, a plea, a desperate prayer. "Say something. Defend me. Be the man your father raised you to be." He turned, ever so slowly, but he didn't look at me. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his face pale and drawn. He saw the piano. He saw his wife. He saw the expensive rug. He saw everything but his own mother. He hunched his shoulders, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, and said nothing. That silence was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. It was louder than Claudia's insults, louder than the storm raging outside. It was the sound of a closing door, the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. It was the ultimate betrayal, delivered not with a shout, but with a coward's averted gaze. A strange calm washed over me. The trembling stopped. The pain was so immense, so absolute, that it became a kind of strength. There were no more tears to cry. I looked from my son's bowed head to my daughter-in-law's smug face. I gave her a single, sharp nod, an acknowledgement of her victory. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the living room. I climbed the grand staircase, each step steady and deliberate. I went into my bedroom, the room I had shared with Arthur for nearly 50 years, and took out a small suitcase. I packed only the essentials: a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, a framed photograph of Arthur. And from the back of my closet, I retrieved the old, intricately carved wooden box. I held it to my chest for a moment, its familiar weight a cold comfort. It was all I had left. It was all I needed. I didn't call Evelyn. Not yet. The wound was too raw, too personal. I couldn't bear to turn my family's tragedy into a legal case file. Not so soon. Instead, I drove to the home of Martha, an old friend from my book club. She was a kind, gentle soul who asked no questions, simply showing me to her spare room with a sad, understanding look in her eyes. The room was small and tidy, a museum of a life that wasn't mine. Needlepoint pillows sat on a floral bedspread, and the walls were covered in framed photos of smiling children and grandchildren I'd never met. It was a safe harbor, but the kindness of it all only amplified my profound sense of displacement. I was an exile, a 76-year-old refugee. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, the springs groaning softly under my weight. The only piece of my life in this room, besides the clothes in my suitcase, was the wooden box. I placed it on my lap, its weight both a burden and an anchor. My fingers traced the intricate carvings of ivy and oak leaves, patterns I knew as well as the lines on my own hands. Arthur had given this box to me on our 10th anniversary. It was meant to hold our keepsakes, the tangible evidence of our shared life. Now it held a time bomb. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and old memories washed over me. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were the artifacts of my marriage. Arthur's silver-rimmed reading glasses, the dried, brittle corsage from our eldest son's wedding, a son we lost too soon to a war far from home, a small, smooth stone we found on a beach in Maine. Each item was a ghost, a whisper of a happier time. And beneath them all, there it was, the letter. It was on Arthur's personal stationery, thick and cream-colored. My name was not on the envelope. In my husband's elegant, sloping script, it read, "For Victor Rowland." The flap was sealed with a dollop of dark red wax, impressed with our family crest, an unbroken seal, a 10-year-old promise. I lifted it from the box. The paper felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of its contents, heavy with the sacrifice it represented. I remembered the night Arthur made me promise, the fear in his eyes, the shame that a man so proud could barely conceal. "He can't know, Agnes," he had pleaded, his voice hoarse. "The shame would break him. He has to believe he can succeed on his own. We give him this, and we never speak of it again. Promise me, unless there is no other way." And I had promised. For 10 years, I had kept that promise. I had watched Victor rebuild his life, always believing his success was his own. I had swallowed the secret, letting it sit like a stone in my gut, all to protect my son from the devastating knowledge of his own failure and to preserve the flawless image he had of his father. But was this not the very definition of no other way? I had been cast out of my home by the very son that home had been sacrificed to save. His wife was planning to sell the last remnant of his father's legacy, a legacy built on a lie Victor himself had created. My fingers tightened on the envelope. Using this letter felt like a second betrayal. Arthur had sacrificed everything to save Victor's future and his pride. If I opened this, I would be destroying the one thing Arthur had died trying to protect: Victor's idealized memory of his father. The letter was my only weapon, my only hope of justice, but it was a weapon that would wound my own son more deeply than any other. It would burn down the entire edifice of his life, revealing the rotten foundations beneath. I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter in my hand, the yellow lamplight casting long shadows on the wall. The hurt and loneliness were a physical ache in my chest. But beneath the pain, something else was beginning to harden, resolve. Arthur had made me promise to protect our son. And right now, protecting him from Claudia, protecting him from his own greed and ignorance, was the most important thing I could do, even if it meant breaking his heart to do it. The time for secrets was over. I spent 2 days in the floral guest room at Martha's house, moving through the hours in a fog of grief and indecision. I would pick up the letter, then put it down. I would walk to the window, watch the world go on without me, and then retreat to the unfamiliar bed. I was adrift on a sea of my own making, and the shore was nowhere in sight. But on the third morning, I woke up with a clarity that was as sharp and cold as the dawn air. The mist clung to the windows, blurring the edges of the trees and houses outside. But my own path forward was finally painfully clear. The time for hiding and hoping was over. I sat on the edge of the bed, my old mobile phone feeling heavy and foreign in my hand. My thumb hovered over Evelyn Hart's name in my contacts list. We had been friends since we were girls in pigtails, sharing secrets and scraped knees. We had seen each other through first loves, marriages, the births of our children, and the deaths of our husbands. She knew me better than anyone on earth. Calling her was admitting the depth of my failure as a mother, laying the wreckage of my family at her feet. It was the hardest call I would ever have to make. My finger finally pressed the screen. It rang twice before she picked up, her voice as crisp and no nonsense as ever, even at this early hour. "Agnes, is everything all right?" The simple, direct question was my undoing. A sob I hadn't realized I was holding back broke free. I pressed my fist to my mouth, trying to stifle the sound, but it was too late. "Agnes, what is it?" Her voice sharpened with alarm. "Where are you? Are you hurt?" I'm fine, Evelyn," I managed to choke out, the words feeling like a lie. "Physically, I'm fine." "That's not what I asked. Talk to me. What's happened? Is it Victor?" I took a shaky breath, the cold morning air stinging my lungs. I couldn't bring myself to say the words. "He kicked me out." It was too humiliating, too final. The story was bigger and more complicated than that. The eviction was just a symptom of a much older, deeper disease. "Evelyn," I said, my voice cracking, "I need you." "Of course. I'll call my clerk and clear my morning. What do you need? A referral to a good litigator? I know the best real estate lawyers in the state." Her immediate leap to legal action, to battle plans and strategy, was exactly why I had hesitated to call. It wasn't what I needed. Not now. "No," I said, cutting her off, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "No lawyers. Not yet. Evelyn, I don't need a judge. I need my friend." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, all the legal sharpness was gone, replaced by the warm, steady voice of the woman who had held my hand at my husband's funeral. "I'm here, Agnes. I'm always here. What do you need?" Tears streamed down my face now, hot and silent. I looked at the wooden box sitting on the nightstand, at the sealed letter that lay within. I was about to set a fire, and I was terrified of the blaze. "I'm about to do something I never wanted to do," I whispered into the phone. Something Arthur made me promise I would only do if I had no other choice. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I'm about to tell Victor the truth about his father." The silence on the line was profound. Evelyn knew what a paragon Arthur was in Victor's eyes. She understood, without me having to explain, the magnitude of what I was about to do. This wasn't a move to get my house back. This was a desperate act of emotional surgery, and I had no idea if the patient would survive. "Where are you?" Evelyn finally said, her voice firm and resolute, leaving no room for argument. Don't move. I'm on my way. Evelyn's home was the complete antithesis of the one I had just fled. Where my house had become a cold, cavernous stage for a family drama, hers was a warm, compact sanctuary filled with the comforting clutter of a life well lived. Books overflowed from shelves, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the air smelled of lemon polish and old paper. She led me to a pair of worn leather armchairs by the fire and poured 2 glasses of brandy without a word. I watched the amber liquid swirl in my glass, the firelight dancing within its depths. For a long moment, I didn't speak, gathering the strength to unearth a secret I had kept buried for a decade. You have to understand, Evelyn, I began, my voice low and raspy. Arthur loved that boy more than life itself. Everything he did to protect him. Evelyn just nodded, her gaze patient and unwavering. She was a judge to her core. She knew how to listen, how to wait for the whole truth to reveal itself. It was about 10 years ago, I said, the memory as vivid and sickening as if it were yesterday. Victor was in his mid-30s, trying to make a name for himself. He'd gotten in with a fast crowd, trying to keep up with the Joneses, making big, risky investments. He was desperate to prove he could be a titan of industry, not just the son of a quiet academic. I took a sip of the brandy, the warmth doing little to quell the chill inside me. We got a call late one night. It was Victor. He was in hysterics. The investments weren't just risky, they were illegal. He'd gotten tangled up in a high-stakes gambling ring, disguised as an investment club. He was in debt up to his eyeballs, on the hook to some very dangerous people for a sum of money that was just astronomical. He was facing ruin, disgrace, and very likely, a prison sentence. Evelyn's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room besides the crackling fire. Arthur didn't even hesitate, I continued, my voice thick with the memory of my husband's quiet strength. He didn't lecture. He didn't say, I told you so. He just went into action. The next morning, he started liquidating. Everything. I looked up from my glass and met my friend's eyes. The stock portfolio he'd spent 40 years building for our retirement? Gone. His collection of 19th century art, the Degas sketches, the small Monet landscape he loved so much, he sold it all, piece by piece, through a private dealer to avoid attention. Every last bit of our liquid assets was gone in a matter of weeks, poured into a black hole to pay off Victor's debt and make the problem disappear. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. But that wasn't the worst of it. That wasn't the secret that had been poisoning my family from the inside out. But it wasn't enough, Evelyn. The debt was too big. So he did the last thing he ever wanted to do. He went to the bank, and he took out a massive mortgage on the house. Evelyn's eyes widened. She leaned forward, her glass forgotten on the table beside her. The Rowland estate? Agnes, that house has been in your family, free and clear, for a century. Not anymore, I said, a bitter finality in my tone. For the last 10 years, we've been living in a house that belongs more to the bank than to us. Arthur did it all in secret. He funneled the money through a lawyer so Victor never knew where it came from. He let Victor believe some mysterious benefactor had bailed him out, that he'd gotten a lucky break. My God, Arthur, Evelyn whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. He made me promise, I said, tears finally welling in my eyes. He said the shame would crush Victor's spirit, that it would break him for good. He wanted Victor to have a clean slate, a chance to rebuild his life without the crushing weight of knowing his father had to sell his soul to save him. So we let him believe the house, the legacy, was all still there, waiting for him. We let him believe he was standing on solid ground, when in reality, he was standing on the ruins of his father's sacrifice. Evelyn sat back, her face a mixture of shock and dawning, furious understanding. The whole sordid picture was finally clear. The reason for Victor's resentment, Claudia's greed, it was all built on a foundation of lies. They were fighting to claim a prize that had already been spent. They were trying to steal a fortune that no longer existed. While I was confessing the family's deepest secret in the warmth of Evelyn's study, a very different scene was unfolding in the cold, stolen rooms of my home. The Rowland mansion was no longer a home. It was a project, a commodity. Victor and Claudia were spread out over the grand mahogany dining table, the same table where Victor had learned his multiplication tables and celebrated every birthday of his life. But instead of family dinners, its surface was now covered with architectural blueprints and glossy brochures for high-end kitchen appliances. They were carving up my life for parts. Claudia, a shark in her element, pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a section of the blueprint. "We'll knock out this wall between the kitchen and the formal dining room," she declared, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "People want open-concept living now. We'll put in a massive island, marble countertops, a 6-burner wolf range. That alone will add 100,000 to the asking price." Victor, who had once been sullen and withdrawn, was now animated, a feverish light in his eyes. He was a man who had finally been given permission to want things, and his appetite was voracious. He leaned over the plans, a grin spreading across his face. "And the study," he said, tapping the paper. "Dad's old sanctuary. We can market it as a CEO-level home office. We'll rip out those dusty old bookshelves and put in sleek, modern cabinetry." "Exactly," Claudia agreed, flipping through a catalog of bathroom fixtures. "No one wants a house that feels like a museum. They want new. They want shiny." They were erasing Arthur. They were erasing me. Every suggestion, every planned demolition was a fresh desecration of our memory. They moved through the house like conquerors, seeing not a home filled with a lifetime of love and laughter, but only square footage and dollar signs. Later, they stood in the living room, a glass of expensive wine in each of their hands. The space felt empty and hollow without Arthur's piano. It was just a room now, devoid of its heart. Victor stared at the empty space where it had once stood. "We'll have the capital we need within a month of the sale," Claudia said, swirling her wine. "Your business plan is solid, Victor. All you've ever needed was a real shot, a chance to get out from under their shadow." Victor took a long swallow of his wine, his eyes gleaming with a manic ambition. He looked around the room, at the high ceilings and the elegant moldings, not as a son looking at his childhood home, but as a CEO surveying his primary asset. "This is it, Claudia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is our ticket. We're not just selling a house. We're buying our future." He took another step, his gaze distant, looking at a future only he could see, a future built on a catastrophic lie. "With this money," he said, his voice dropping to a near-reverent whisper, "I will finally show her. I'll show my mother that I'm not the screw-up she always thought I was. I'll build an empire. I'll be more successful than my father ever dreamed of being." The irony was a physical thing, a bitter taste in the air that only an unseen audience could perceive. He stood there, plotting to build his glorious future on the very foundation of his father's silent, loving sacrifice. He was a man celebrating his escape from a prison whose walls were built of his own ignorance, a prison his father had died to keep him from ever discovering. He was a king planning his coronation, oblivious to the fact that his crown had been paid for with the last coin in his family's kingdom. Evelyn's home office was a world away from her cozy living room. Here, there were no crackling fires or overstuffed armchairs. The room was paneled in dark mahogany, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound law books that smelled of dust and authority. A massive desk, clear of everything but a single lamp and a notepad, dominated the space. This was not the office of a friend. It was the chamber of a judge. I sat in a stiff-backed chair opposite her, the brandy glass from earlier replaced with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. The adrenaline from my confession had faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. "So what do we do?" I asked it, my voice barely a whisper. "Do I sue him for the house? Can I even do that?" Evelyn steepled her fingers, her expression thoughtful and serious. She was no longer just my friend, my confidant. The Honorable Evelyn Hart was now on the bench. "We could," she said, her voice measured. "We could file a suit. It would be a long, ugly, and very public fight. It would be a battle of he said, she said. They would paint you as a confused, vindictive old woman. We would paint them as greedy, heartless children. The lawyers would get rich. The papers would have a field day, and your family would be ripped to shreds in the town square. And in the end, after months or even years, you might get the house back. A house so poisoned by the fight you'd never want to live in it again." She let that grim picture hang in the air. "That's one way to play it," she continued. "But it's not our way. We're not fighting for property, Agnes. We're fighting for the truth. And the truth doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs a stage." She swiveled in her high-backed leather chair and pulled a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper from a drawer. It was heavy, official-looking stationery. "We are not going to sue them," she said, a glint in her eye I hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a master strategist preparing her opening move. "We are going to summon them." She began to write, her pen scratching authoritatively across the page. "This isn't a lawsuit. It's not a request. It is a formal, non-negotiable summons to a family meeting." I leaned forward, watching as she crafted the document. It looked for all the world like a legal subpoena. She used formal, binding language, citing the execution of a family estate. "What does it say?" I asked. Evelyn turned the paper around for me to read. It was titled, in bold letters, "Official Summons for a Family Meeting." It went on, "You are hereby summoned to attend a private meeting at the Rowland family residence on a date 1 week from today at 2:00 in the afternoon. The agenda for this mandatory meeting is the formal reading of the last will and testament and the unsealing of the sealed personal correspondence of the late Mr. Arthur Rowland." My breath caught in my throat. It was brilliant. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It wasn't an accusation. It was an obligation. It wasn't a fight over a house. It was a solemn duty concerning their father's final wishes. It was a trap they would be forced to walk into, driven by their own greed and curiosity. They would assume the sealed correspondence was about some hidden asset, some secret stock portfolio they could get their hands on. They would be expecting more money. "They can't ignore this," Evelyn said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "It has the weight of a legal command. To refuse would be to show profound disrespect to Arthur's memory, a position even Claudia can't spin her way out of." She made a second copy, placed them both in official-looking envelopes, and sealed them. "I'll have these delivered by a court-certified process server this afternoon," she explained. "They'll be served, just like in a real case. It will be official. It will be intimidating, and it will be inescapable." I looked at the envelopes sitting on her desk. It felt like we were mailing 2 bombs. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. This was it. The die was cast. In 1 week, I would walk back into my home, not as a victim, but as the executioner of a truth that would shatter my son's world. This wasn't a battle for a house anymore. It was a trial. And the only thing on the docket was a decade of lies. The drive back to my house was a study in déjà vu. The sky was the same bruised purple, the clouds heavy and low. A persistent, miserable drizzle slicked the roads and blurred the grand old houses of our neighborhood into watercolor paintings of gray and brown. It was the same weather, the same oppressive atmosphere as the day I had been cast out. But this time, I was not fleeing in shame. I was returning to declare a war I never wanted to fight. Evelyn drove, her hand steady on the wheel, her expression calm and unreadable. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands clenched tightly around the wooden box in my lap. It felt colder, heavier than ever before. With every mile that brought us closer to the house, the dread in my stomach grew, coiling like a serpent. This was necessary, I told myself. This was the only way. But the mantra did little to soothe the aching heart of a mother about to inflict a terrible wound on her only child. When we pulled into the long, sweeping driveway, I saw Victor's Lexus parked near the front steps. They were here. They were waiting. We didn't knock. I used my old key, the familiar brass cool against my palm. The lock turned with a well-oiled click, and we stepped inside. The scene in the living room was exactly as I had pictured. Victor and Claudia were seated on the modern, soulless sofa they must have bought to replace my comfortable chintz one. A fire roared in the hearth, but it offered no warmth, only a frantic, dancing light that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. They both looked up as we entered, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and impatience. Claudia had a glass of wine in her hand and a smirk on her lips. She was treating this not as a solemn family meeting, but as an inconvenient interruption to her afternoon. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "The guest of honor arrives. I hope you don't mind. We started without you." She gestured with her glass toward the fire. Victor, as usual, refused to meet my eye. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. He looked like a man being forced to attend his own execution. He knew, on some level, that this was not going to be a simple affair. The official summons had spooked him. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, speaking to the fire instead of to me. I ignored them both. Evelyn walked past the sofa with the quiet authority of a queen entering her court and placed her leather briefcase on the mahogany coffee table. The sound, a solid, definitive thud, seemed to suck the air out of the room. She then turned to face them. "This is not a social call," Evelyn said, her voice calm and clear, carrying the weight of 1,000 courtroom rulings. "This is a formal proceeding. We are here to execute the final wishes of Arthur Rowland." Claudia let out a little laugh, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Oh, please. Spare us the drama, Evelyn. We all know what this is. It's a last-ditch effort. A desperate Hail Mary from a woman who can't accept she's lost." She took a deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes glittering with malice over the rim of the glass. "So, what is it, Agnes? Did you find some obscure codicil to the will? A hidden document you think gives you a claim?" She still thought she was in control. She believed this was a game of legal chess, and she was confident she owned all the powerful pieces. She saw me as a weak, sentimental old woman, easily outmaneuvered. She had no idea that I wasn't there to play her game. I was there to burn the entire board. I didn't answer her. My gaze was fixed on my son. I saw the flicker of conflict in his eyes, the deep-seated discomfort warring with the greed Claudia had so carefully nurtured. He was miserable, and in that moment, all I felt was a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. He was my child, and I was about to destroy the world he knew. I was about to show him that the man he was trying to become was a pale imitation of the man his father had truly been. The room was silent except for the hiss and crackle of the fire. Evelyn snapped open her briefcase and retrieved a slim file folder. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace that amplified the tension in the room. This was her courtroom, and the proceedings had begun. We will begin with the last will and testament of Arthur Rowland, signed and dated 2 years prior to his passing, she announced, her voice resonating with official gravity. She put on a pair of reading glasses and began to read. The will was simple, straightforward, and exactly what one would expect. Arthur's personal effects were left to me and Victor. A few charitable donations were specified. And then, the final clause. To my beloved wife, Agnes Rowland, I leave, in its entirety, our family home located at 214 Lakeside Drive, along with all its contents, to be hers for the duration of her life. Claudia let out a short, derisive snort. How sentimental, and completely irrelevant. The transfer of title was legally executed weeks ago. This changes nothing. She crossed her arms, looking supremely confident, bored even. Evelyn didn't even glance at her. She carefully folded the will and placed it back in the file. That, she said calmly, was the public record. We now move to the private one. From her briefcase, she withdrew a single, thick, cream-colored envelope, its back sealed with a familiar crest of dark red wax. She held it up for them to see. And this, she said, her voice dropping slightly, is the final addendum, a private letter, written by Arthur Rowland and sealed 10 years ago. It was entrusted to Agnes with the explicit instruction that it be opened only under the most dire of circumstances, in the presence of his son. She placed the letter on the table in front of me. The finality of the gesture was absolute. Claudia's smirk finally wavered. A flicker of unease crossed her face. This wasn't in her script. Victor, however, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. He stared at the envelope, his face draining of all color. He knew what this was. He knew this was the day of reckoning. My hand trembled as I picked it up. I broke the 10-year-old seal. The crackle of the wax was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to read, my voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with every devastating word. My dearest Victor, I read, if you are reading this, it means your mother has been forced into a position I prayed she would never face. There is a truth about my legacy and your inheritance that you need to know. I paused, taking a breath, and looked at my son. His eyes were wide with terror. 10 years ago, you made a terrible mistake. A mistake that cost more than money. It threatened to cost you your future. The debt you incurred was immense, son. Far more than you ever knew. It was enough to send you to prison for a very long time. Claudia's face went rigid. Her eyes darted from me to Victor, a silent, furious question in them. I could not let that happen. I continued reading Arthur's words. So I paid it. I sold my art collection. I liquidated our retirement portfolio. And when that was not enough, I mortgaged this house, our home, to its very foundations to secure your freedom. I did it all in secret because I wanted to give you something more valuable than money. I wanted to give you a clean slate. The room was utterly still. Claudia's mouth had fallen slightly open. The wine glass sat forgotten in her hand. The $2.1 million prize she had fought so hard for had just evaporated into a mountain of bank debt. Her perfect face, for the first time, looked pale and ugly with the shock of a failed con. I read the final lines, my voice ringing with a terrible, heartbreaking clarity. The greatest inheritance I leave you is not this house, Victor. It is the chance to live your life as a free and honorable man. Your mother and I gave you your true inheritance long ago. Don't disappoint her. The letter fell from my fingers onto the table. The silence that followed was absolute. Then a sound broke it, a low, guttural sob. Victor collapsed. He didn't just sit or slump. He fell from the sofa onto his knees, his body folding in on itself as if he'd been struck a mortal blow. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to heave with wrenching, soul-shattering sobs. It wasn't the sound of sadness. It was the sound of a man's entire world, his entire sense of self, being utterly and irrevocably destroyed. The arrogant son, the resentful businessman, the man who thought he'd been cheated. It all burned away in that moment, leaving only the ashes of a boy who finally understood the crushing weight of his father's love. The pale face in the room was not Claudia's. It was his. 6 months have passed. The autumn that saw my world crumble has given way to a crisp, bright spring. I no longer live in the grand, shadowed house by the lake. It's been sold. The sale barely covered the massive mortgage Arthur had taken out and a few outstanding debts, leaving very little left over. But it wasn't about the money. Selling it was a necessary amputation, a cutting away of the diseased limb that had poisoned our family for a decade. The house was never a home after Arthur died. It was a monument to a lie. Now, it's just a property, a line item on a ledger, and its power over us is gone. I live in a small apartment downtown now. It has 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a large window in the living room that floods the space with morning light. It's not a mansion filled with priceless antiques, but it's mine. It's quiet, it's peaceful, and it's honest. I've filled it with my books, a few cherished photographs, and Arthur's favorite armchair, which was the only thing I insisted on keeping. Claudia, as expected, was gone before the ink was dry on the bank papers. She vanished from Victor's life as quickly and silently as a snake shedding its skin. Her interest was never in my son, only in the lifestyle she thought he could provide. When the $2 million mirage evaporated, so did she. I have not heard from her since, and I suspect I never will. The doorbell rang this afternoon. It's a sound I'm still getting used to. I opened it to find Victor standing in the hallway. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple polo shirt and work pants. The arrogant, entitled set of his jaw had softened. He looked tired, older, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. He didn't say hello. He just held up a small metal toolbox. "Martha mentioned your kitchen faucet was dripping," he said, his voice quiet. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked straight to the kitchen, and for the next half hour, the only sounds were the metallic clinking of his tools and the occasional frustrated grunt. He wasn't making a grand gesture. He was just fixing a leaky faucet. It was a small, practical, necessary act. It was a start. When he was finished, he washed his hands at the now silent sink and dried them on a dish towel. "I'll make some tea," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded and sat down in his father's armchair. I brought 2 mugs into the living room and set them on the small table between us. We sat there in silence, sipping our tea as the afternoon sun streamed through the window. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of our last days in the mansion. This was a different kind of quiet. It was a fragile, tentative peace, the kind of stillness that comes after a violent storm has passed, leaving the air clean and new. He has a job now, working for a local construction company. He manages their inventory. It's not glamorous. It doesn't come with stock options or a corner office, but it's an honest living, earned with his own 2 hands. He is starting over from scratch, from ground zero. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." The words would have been inadequate, hollow. But I heard his apology in the silence of the fixed faucet. I saw it in the way he sat in his father's chair, not as an heir claiming his throne, but as a humbled visitor. I felt it in the quiet space between us, a space no longer filled with resentment and lies, but with the shared, unspoken weight of the truth. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not always a grand declaration. Sometimes it is a quiet afternoon. It is a shared cup of tea. It is the silent acknowledgement that what was broken can, with time and effort, be mended. Our family will never be what it was, but as my son stood to leave, giving me a brief, awkward nod, I knew this was not an ending. It was a new and much more difficult beginning. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.